Hello and welcome friends. In unit 2 we were discussing communication mix, and up till now we have completed quite a few topics. We have talked about the marketing communication process. We talked about the elements of effective communication. We talked about the communication platforms available to us. We also talked about the various steps involved in developing an effective communication campaign, right? If you remember, these are the various steps which are part of the process. And if you remember, out of these we have already discussed identifying the target audience, determining the communication objective, and then message designing. And plus, in the last session that we had, we talked about selecting the communication channel, right? Now today we'll be moving over to the next steps. The next step is establishing the communication budget, so we'll be moving over to it. So this is a short recap of whatever we have done in the last few sessions. So today we are going to move over to the communication budget. How do we determine how much we are going to spend on our communication campaign or our promotional campaign, right? So there are basically four different methods which are used to do this, and these four methods have been listed here. And what we have done basically here in this particular slide is we have also made a comparison of these four methods, how they compare with one another. We have talked about the method here. In the first column you can have a look at the methods. Then we have talked about what basically is done in this particular method, in a particular method, and what are the strengths and the weaknesses of a particular method. Now if you have a look at the slide and the first method that is there, the first method is the affordable method. So how do you decide the communication budget? Whatever you can afford, you spend that much. So you budget for the amount that you can afford to spend on communication, right? What is the strength of this method? This method is very simple. You don't have to do any complicated calculation. You only have to determine whatever you can afford. Accordingly, you'll have to spend on your communication campaign. However, what are the weaknesses? The weakness is, number one, this is subjective decision. It is not based on any research. It is not based on any expected outcomes. So it is basically a subjective decision. It requires a lot of subjectivity. It involves a lot of subjectivity. Again, long range planning is not possible. Many a times when you are going for communication campaigns, it is just not for 1 year or just 1 month or 2 months or 1 season. Generally you have a long-term plan in place, but in this particular case, if you are going for this affordable method of determining the communication budget, you would not be able to plan for the long term, because every year you would be spending only whatever you can afford. So next year again you would look for how much you can afford. So every year there would be a separate plan, and the total expenditure would be different depending on whatever you can afford. So you simply cannot plan for a 5-year horizon or a 10-year time period. You only can plan for that particular year, right? So long range planning is not possible. Again, one more issue with this particular method is that it ignores communication's role as investment. It basically assumes communication to be a cost. It does not think of communication as an investment, because basically when you are spending money on your communication campaign, basically you are doing an investment with the expectation of some future result, future outcome, and the future outcome that you are expecting is increase in sales, increase in goodwill, more trials by new customers, repeat purchases. So there are different objectives which you have in your mind. So basically communication is an investment. However, this particular method assumes communication to be a cost. So this is one more weakness of this particular method. The affordable method, however, this is the simplest. You spend whatever you can afford. Now then we have got the second method, which is known as the percentage of sales method. I hope you can understand what it means. You determine a particular percentage of the sales that you would be spending for your communication campaign. So let's say, for example, you decide, okay, 20% of whatever my sales forecast is, I would be spending on communication campaign, right? So for example, if I believe that my sales in this particular year, in this coming year, let's say the sales forecast in the coming year is going to be, let's say, 100 crores. So what will I do? I'll find out 20%, because this is the percentage that I've already determined. 20% of 100 crore would be around 20 crores. So I would be spending that much amount for the communication campaign, right? Now again, this is a very simple method, and that is the strength of this method. And if everybody else in the market, the other rivals in the market also use the same method, there would be significant stability in the market, because everybody would be spending according to their forecast. So naturally there would be stability in the market in this sense. So it would not lead to any aggressive advertising. Everybody is determined to preserve their own turf. So everybody is determined to preserve their own market share, and everybody else is deciding the communication campaign budget depending on how much they would be able to sell. So this would lead to stability in the market. There would not be very aggressive moves, aggressive communication campaigns by any of the market players. So that would lead to a stable kind of a market. If everybody else, all the other rivals, are using this method. Again, please understand one more thing, that generally this kind of method is preferred by finance department. The finance division would prefer this. Why? Because now they don't have to do any complicated calculation. They only have to determine the sales forecast. Based on that, they will be able to calculate how much the communication campaign has to be provided, how much budget the communication campaign or the communication division or the marketing division has to be provided for the communication campaign. So generally these kind of methods are preferred by the finance division, right? However, there are some weaknesses inherent in this particular method. Let's have a look at these weaknesses. First weakness is that the budget fluctuates from year to year. Naturally, the budget would fluctuate. Why would the budget fluctuate? See, because the sales forecast would be different from one particular year to the other. So naturally, when the sales forecast is different, the percentage of sales forecast which you have decided to devote for your communication campaign, that percentage though would remain same, but the total amount would be different every single year. I'll give you an example. Let's say I have decided 20% of my sales forecast I would devote to communication campaign, right? This year, let's say the sales forecast is 100 crores, so 20% would be 20 crore. Next year, let's say the sales forecast is 150 crores. Here the 20% of 150 crore would be 30 crores. So next year I would be spending 30 crores. Let's say in the next year, supposing let's say it's a COVID year, COVID-19 year, sales forecast goes down and it becomes, let's say, 50 crores. Then the 20% of 50 crore would only be 10 crores. So there would be a lot of fluctuation in the budget. And again, long-term planning would not be possible, because you would be able to plan only for the current year, wherein you have a good idea about your sales forecast. But since you do not have any idea about the sales forecast in the next year or next to next year, you would not be able to plan for the long term, right? Now, one more important aspect is that it is very, very difficult in this kind of a method to go for counter-cyclical promotional campaigns. Now, what do we mean by counter-cyclical? Counter is basically the opposite and cyclical is basically referring to the business cycle or to the trade cycle. I hope you remember the trade cycle that you have read in macroeconomics, right? Depression, then recovery, prosperity. So these 3-4 stages were there, right? Now, what do we mean by counter-cyclical promotion? Counter-cyclical promotion is whenever there is a decrease in sales. Let's say it's a stage of depression. Now, there is a decrease in sales. Counter-cyclical would mean you increase your communication efforts. You increase your communication expenditure in this kind of a phase. And whenever there is a recovery, whenever the market is looking good, whenever the sales forecast is good, you reduce your expenditure, and it makes a lot of sense. Because as far as the recovery phase or the prosperity phase is concerned, the sales are already high. So there is no point in spending too much on the communication campaign. On the other hand, whenever there is a depression phase, the sales are already low. So if you spend more on communication campaign, naturally your sales might pick up, right? So this is what is known as counter-cyclical promotion campaign. Is that fine? Again, for example, within a year also, we can have counter-seasonal promotional campaigns. For example, suppose I am selling ice creams, and generally the ice creams get sold around April to, let's say, September or October. So counter-cyclical promotional campaign would be, I am going for more expenditure, I am spending more on communication campaign when the sales are low, that is during the winter months from October, November to March. And when the sales are high, that is in the summer months, I reduce my promotional expenditure. And this makes sense. This will help you level the demand. You would be able to boost your demand by additional spending during November, October and up till March. This would increase the demand in this season, which is generally an off season for ice creams. And then what will happen is that you will have a level demand throughout the year. So many a times companies and firms go for counter-cyclical promotional tactics and counter-seasonal promotional tactics, right? Now this again would not be possible here. Now what is the reason why this would not be possible here? Please understand, counter-cyclical would mean that if the sales are low, you spend more. However, here the percentage of sales method will do what? If percentage of sales method is used, what will happen? Counter-cyclical, when the sales are low, according to the percentage of sales method, the absolute amount of expenditure, absolute budget dedicated to communication campaign would also be low. However, we want to do the exact opposite. We want to spend more in our communication campaign. This would not be possible here. Is that okay? Again, when the sales are already high, this particular method will give me a very high amount of absolute communication budget. The amount of budget would be more because the sales are already more. But we do not want that kind of promotional campaign here. We want to reduce our expenditure on communication campaign here. So this would not be possible. So counter-cyclical promotional tactics simply cannot be used with this particular method. This is one major weakness of this particular method. Again, one more issue with this particular method is this assumes that the sales are independent. Sales basically are independent of promotion. It assumes that promotion is dependent on sales. Please understand, how do we determine how much we are going to sell, how much we are going to spend in our communication campaign? So we determine this based on a particular percentage of our sales forecast. So percentage of sales forecast is what we are going to spend as far as our budget is concerned, right? So it is basically assuming this budget is dependent on a particular percentage of sales. So whatever is the sales, that will determine the budget which we'll have for our communication campaign. However, this is not the case. The communication campaign, the budget should not depend on sales, because ultimately the sales are dependent on promotion. How much you are going to sell is dependent on how much you are promoting the product, if all other things are equal. If there are 3 firms in the market, let's say all of them have the same quality of product, all of them are giving the same margin to their distributors and dealers, then ultimately how much a particular company is able to sell in the market will be dependent on how much they're spending on communication campaigns. However, this method does the exact opposite. It does what? It decides your budget according to whatever your sales forecast is. So basically here the budget is dependent, the communication budget is dependent on sales forecast. Here the communication campaign is dependent on sales forecast. While the reality is that the sales forecast is dependent on the communication campaign. The more you spend on your communication campaign, it is likely that it will result in more sales, right? So it actually does not do this. It uses the exact opposite approach, right? Then we have got the competitive parity method. Now what do we mean by the competitive parity method? Competitive means you are talking about the rivals in the market. Parity means equality here. Now what do we mean by competitive parity method? So basically what you do is you determine your communication budget depending on what the others are doing in the market. What are other marketers doing as far as that particular industry is concerned? So you try to achieve a parity with your rivals in the market. So for example, BBA department will do what? It will try to find out how much various other institutes in the region, be it Graphic Error or be it Amrapali, they are spending on their communication campaigns. Accordingly, I'll decide how much I will spend on my communication campaign so that there is a parity between me and my rivals in the market. Now this is what is known as the competitive parity method, right? So what you do is you do an average of the industry spend. What do we mean by this? All the marketers in the industry, how much they are spending in their communication campaign, I will find the average, and that is the amount that I'll be spending for my own communication campaign. This is fine. Now what is the advantage? The advantage is, again, this is a simple method. You simply have to find out how much the other rivals in the market are spending. You simply have to do an average, and then that would be the amount that you will have to spend for your communication campaign. However, there are certain weaknesses in this particular method. What are the weaknesses? See, different marketers can have different strategies, and naturally different markets have different amount of resources available to them. For example, 2 different companies may have 2 different strategies. One company banks on advertisements and various other communication tools, while the other company banks on sales promotion. For example, they are providing more margins to their dealers so that the dealers would push their products. So naturally this second company, which is giving a higher margin to its dealers, would not be spending that much on advertising, for example. So different companies will have different strategies. Again, different companies have different amount of money available with them, amount of financial resources available with them. Think of a big company. It will have more resources at its disposal. On the other hand, a small company will have much less resources. So naturally, it does not make sense to try and match what your rivals are doing, because they may have a different strategy and they may have different financial resources available with them. So this is one weakness of this particular method. Again, this particular method also does not suit the new entrant. Now what will happen? Please understand. A new entrant in the market, in any industry. Now what will this new entrant have to do? It will find out how much the other companies, other rivals in the market are spending, and accordingly it will try to achieve parity by spending the same amount. But please understand, the already entrenched rivals, the already established rivals will have lots of resources, since they are already there in the market, so they will have lots of resources. So naturally it's not possible for this new entrant to spend that much, because it's a new entrant in the market, maybe a small one. It probably would not have that kind of resources, so it would not be of any use. In fact, it would not be possible for this new entrant to spend the same amount of money, right? So this is again one weakness of this particular method, competitive parity method. However, again, it's a very simple method, and that is its strength. Now let's talk about the objective and task method. Now what do we mean by objective and task method? Please understand, we determine what our objectives are, what do we want to achieve through our communication campaigns, right? And to achieve those objectives, what are the tasks that we have to undertake, right? And to undertake those tasks, how much money we will have to spend. So this is how in this particular method we decide our communication budget. So first of all, we decide what our goals are, then we go for what all programs or what all things we need to do, what all tasks we need to undertake to achieve those goals, and then accordingly we decide what will be our budget, right? Here the budget would be linked to outcomes, right? Should we first take up an example of this method, right? So now this is the example of this particular method. Here the objective has been specified right in the beginning. We have to increase the brand awareness from 20 to 60% in Kumaon region. So I'm just giving a brief idea of how objective and task method works, though it's a relatively more complicated method, but I'm just giving a brief idea, right? So let's say a particular brand wants to increase its awareness levels from 20%. The current awareness levels are just 20%, and it wants it to be tripled to 60%. Right, that is the objective that this particular company has set for itself, right? Again, now here basically what we have done is we have worked out the various tasks that we need to perform to achieve this objective, right? And we have seen that 1% increase in awareness. So from 20 to 21, if you want to increase awareness from 20% to 21%, then you require 3 exposures to newspaper advertisements. What do we mean by this? This means that a particular individual, that the particular market, if it sees the advertisements thrice, 3 times, then the awareness level would increase from 20 to 21%. Do you understand the point? Right? So this is one task that we have. We have to ensure appropriate number of exposures so that the brand awareness increase from 20% to 60%, or a increase of 40%, right? So this is what we have to do, and we know for every single increase in percentage we need 3 exposures. We need our target audience to see the ad at least thrice, right? Now we know that our print advertisement, one print advertisement shall cost us rupees 15,000, right? Fine. Now we will be deciding the budget based on these pieces of information. Now this is the objective, this was the task. We had to increase the exposure to newspaper advertisements, we had to expose our target audience to newspaper advertisements, and now we are trying to calculate the budget, right? So let's have a look at this particular calculation here. Now we have to increase the budget by 40%, right? So 40 has been mentioned here, and for every increase we need 3 exposures. So naturally for 40 increase we need 120 exposure. So 40 into 3 would be 120, and for every exposure we will have to spend 15,000, right? So this is what we will have to spend on newspaper advertisements. Is that fine? So 18 lakh would be our expenditure on newspaper advertisements. Once we do this, we will be able to get 120 exposures, and this 120 exposures will lead to increase in brand awareness from 20% to 60%. Now is this making sense to you? Right? So this is how we determine the budget in this particular method, but please understand that this was a very simplified version of the method. See, you do not only go for newspaper advertisements, you may have television advertisements lined up. You may go for various kind of public relation exercises. You may host an event, right? You may sponsor an event. You may hire some celebrity to endorse your product. You may go for sales promotion. So there are so many things that you will do, but whatever you will do, you will make use of this approach, and then you will calculate the budget, right? Here I have only talked about newspaper advertisement, but there are so many other things that you will do. But then for all the things that you do to promote your product, you will have to do this calculation, and this way you will be able to calculate the overall communication expenditure, the overall budget for your communication campaigns. Is this fine? Now you can understand that this is a very, very objective method. Why this is objective? This is not based on any predetermined notions. It is not based on your experience. It is based on clear-cut data. You know you have to increase your brand awareness by 40%, and you know that every 1% increase in brand awareness would require 3 exposures, and every exposure will cost you ₹15,000. So there is objectivity in this particular method, and one very important aspect is that it is linked with your goals. So you know what your goals are, and then you have linked it up with your tasks, and then you have linked it up with your budget, right? So the goals or the objectives are what you start with. So this is one strength of this particular method. However, one problem with this particular method is this requires a lot of complicated calculations, tedious calculations, and you need to calculate all these things, which again is going to be a time consuming task. So this is why many companies don't use this particular method, because this requires a lot of calculation, a lot of tedious calculation. This is fine. So this is how we determine our communication budget. These 4 methods are there. The first 3 methods are more of subjective methods. They involve a lot of subjectivity, while the 4th method is much more objective than the other 3. Naturally, if there is a small company in the market, what will they do? A small company in the market, a small firm in the market, they probably would not have the resources to go for this kind of a method. They might go for affordable method. They might go for competitive parity method. Now what do we do here in Department of Business Administration? What do we do here? We basically go for the affordable method. Whatever we can afford, we spend, just because we do not have the resources to go for this particular method, right? So again, the same thing happens with small firms in so many places. They probably won't have the resources to do all these calculations, so they go for affordable method, or maybe a percentage of sales method, or a competitive parity method, right? So this is how the various marketers determine their budget for the communication campaign. With this lecture today, now we have completed this one more step as far as the process of designing the communication campaign is concerned. The process of coming up with a communication program is concerned. In the next sessions that we'll have, we'll move over to the next steps, and hopefully we'll wrap up the remaining 3 steps in one session. Thank you very much for your time.